When discussing the Louisville Cardinals ahead of the 2024 college football season, it seems like there is a trend that three certain players are continually being overlooked. We'll identify who they are on today's episode of Locked On Louisville.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Card Nation, what is going on, everyone? Welcome into this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use the code Locked On College for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. And as always, I want to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast, free and available on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. Appreciate all of the shares and subscriptions. Definitely hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already. It does not go unnoticed nor unappreciated. We begin the five-part series that is ranking the top 15 players for the Louisville football team ahead of the season. We begin with veteran leadership on the offensive line. First player we'll talk about is on the offensive line. Then transitioning into a playmaker that has taken the next step. And then finally, a standout defensive back added to the defensive backfield. Before we identify who number 15 is, if you didn't tune in to this series last offseason, I didn't necessarily feel great with the criteria or the rubric that I kind of put forth, although the player rankings were fairly close as to what I would have had them end up being. But nonetheless, I made some mistakes, and thankfully I've kind of learned from those due to trial and error. So basically, I've kind of taken away like positional value from this particular argument, because if that was the case, quarterback, star edge rusher, left tackle, star cornerback one, that's going to be your highest positions of value, so to speak. So I kind of took that out. So it's a matter of amount of talent as it relates to the position, what the production could look like, the impact that they'll have on the Cardinals this season, so on and so forth. And there were some names left off this list that I look back on and I'm like, man, I don't know. But that's just a testament to how well Jeff Brohm did, not only in the transfer portal, but retaining a good amount of this talent from last year's team. We start with number 15, who is one of those players that was brought in via the transfer portal. That is center Pete Nygra. Pete transferred in from Northern Illinois. He started 2 seasons there, all 12 games this past season, and he was phenomenal for the squad. Now, Nygra listed at 6'4", 300 pounds. When he committed, people were like, what does he bring to the table? Now, I think that that's sort of an issue for any like offensive line commitments, because let's face it, getting a commitment from an offensive lineman doesn't really carry the same hype of getting the commitment from a wide receiver or a quarterback or a star defender. I think it's the least appreciated unit on the field is the offensive line. And the reality of the situation here is that replacing Brian Hudson, almost impossible. Really challenging, to say the least. Multiple year guy who was phenomenal for almost every single game that he played, even with dealing with injury that he had sustained early on in the season. But nonetheless, I say all that to say that replacing Brian Hudson, being the guy after the guy, is no small task. And I know at the end of the season, I'm thinking to myself, well, Austin Collins is probably the internal piece that is slated to compete for that. Louisville went out and got 2 interior offensive linemen, Pete Nygra and Victor Cutler from Ohio State. Nygra, one of the best centers in the MAC. He was the second highest graded center in the MAC. Like I said, 2-year starter, started all 12 games, did not give up a sack this entire year. In 772 blocking snaps the past 2 seasons, for his squad. He gave up 2 quarterback hits and 6 quarterback hurries. You don't really get much more impressive than that. So why he's on this list, number one, I think that he's going to play a role for this team that will get consistently overlooked because that is the nature of how things are. The center position doesn't get the credit and the acknowledgement that the position should. It should be highly regarded like left tackle because it is arguably as important, and I don't think people are ready to really have that conversation. Shout out to my guy, Keith Artoff, producer from the Pink Seats podcast, who's been on the show a couple of times. He, former college offensive lineman, so the appreciation is there. When he jumped on the show, we previewed the offensive line. He said, yeah, don't underappreciate the center position because a lot of things can go wrong if you struggle with that spot. And look at Alabama. It might have. Now, other things happened there, but it was one of the reasons why the Crimson Tide went from losing to Michigan in the semifinal to potentially winning it all again under Nick Saban. The center position was one of the reasons that they didn't end up getting there. And unfortunately, that is the case sometimes. But the impact that he's going to bring right away, penciled in starter, the top center on the team, especially for an offense that's trying to gel, new quarterback, new running backs, new receivers, new tight ends, even new pieces on the offensive line. You lose a lot of that leadership up front in the trenches. Having a player with his leadership is going to be extremely, extremely helpful for a team that is looking to replicate, probably do more than just replicate, upgrade the level of success that they had. So you have that veteran leadership. And I think that ultimately he's going to be a very solid replacement for Hudson. One of the best centers in the ACC coming up, I feel like, is going to be on the docket for Pete Nygra, who people will look at where he came from the MAC, and say, well, I mean, yeah, he was pretty good for Northern Illinois. Is he going to be good enough to play for Louisville and, better yet, be a star at Louisville? And admittedly, I don't think he's going to be a first-round pick or anything like that, but I do think he's going to be, at the very, very least, extremely serviceable and high-end, all-ACC caliber level player. So I know that when you think of the top players, some people will hear this and be like, oh, wow, okay, an offensive lineman is one of the top 15 players. That just doesn't move me. It should. Becoming a true understander, that's not even a word. Becoming a person with true understanding of the game of football. I need to coin that, understander. Wow, I'm not sure that that's ever been used in the English language, but I could be wrong. Well, I mean, it is in Merriam-Webster, one that understands. Understander, I mean, I guess it's a word if it's in the dictionary, but nonetheless, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. Understanding the game of football is accepting that offensive line has a huge impact on it, and some people just overlook it. So I would caution you to be, to be in a bad mood or just not really like that an offensive lineman, because he's not going to be the last one on this list. But having offensive linemen in your top 15, I think that it's critical. Really, what you need to be looking for is balance amongst the position, which, judging by looking at my top 15 right now, there is balance. So having players, I would be more frightened if there weren't players from the offensive line. If you look at your team and you say, okay, give me your top 15 players, and none of them are offensive linemen, you kind of go back to like the 2018 days where Louisville had really good skill players. Like they had Tutu Atwell, they had some Javian Hawkins, they had really good players, but it didn't matter because the Cardinals were so bad in the trenches, especially the offensive line, that, again, you have to have a balance. And I think that Nygra is a great beginning to this list, coming in at number 15. The only thing holding him from going higher is I think that he's going to be one of the better centers in the ACC. I'm not sure that he's going to be the best. I'm not even sure that he's going to be the top graded player on the offensive line. I think he's at the very least going to be serviceable. So he's good enough to land on this list. It came down between him and a couple of other players on that offense and a couple of players on defense as well. But I gave him the nod because he's going to be a starter right away. He's going to play a huge impact for this team, for this offensive line, and for the offensive unit as a whole. So we start out at number 15 with center Pete Nygra. We stay on the offensive side of the ball. For number 14, it is a playmaker taking the next step. We'll identify who that is coming up here in the next segment of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Today's episode of the show brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch, and that's not just limited to baseball. If you've been listening to the show during these reads, you've known that I've used Gametime for basketball and football, and the same holds true for both of those sports. I haven't used them for baseball, but I definitely will when the Astros travel to Cincinnati to play the Reds here in just under a month. And the reason that I've switched fully and won't use anybody else but Gametime is the Gametime app. Download it. You can see the all-in pricing, which is a feature that shows the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. You can get the seat views with a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. And then there's the lowest price guarantee. So that means if you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets, MLB tickets as well with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE, Locked On College for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thanks again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On College Football podcast. Spencer McLaughlin gets you ready for an exciting season on the gridiron with discussion on the upcoming season and the ever-changing landscape of college athletics, including conference realignment, the transfer portal, NIL, new college football expanded playoffs, and more. Locked On College Football is available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. Into the second segment of this initial top 15 player ranking series, we just identified who number 15 was. That was Pete Nygra. Moving down the list, staying on the offensive side of the ball, number 14 is a playmaker taking the next step from last year to this year, having a great offseason and spring ball. That is wide receiver Chris Bell. Some won't agree with this. Some will see Chris Bell as a guy that should be higher on this list. To me, that just confirms that the opinion on Bell, it's really different on both sides of the argument. Like some think, oh no, he's a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 at best, and some believe he's got wide receiver 1 potential. I'm in the middle, more so leaning towards the latter. Chris Bell had a breakout season this past season for the Cardinals in his first year under Jeff Brohm. As a sophomore, he caught 29 passes, 407 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Compare that to the season before, 7 for 105 and no touchdowns. Bell improved everything except for yards per reception, which you increase the volume exponentially, and I don't really care about that. But the 6'2", 220-pound native of Yazoo City, Mississippi, has had a really, really good spring. I will introduce this as sort of background info that really does, it really is appropriate to the matter. You bring in a new coaching staff coming off of a freshman season where you didn't get a ton of opportunities, 7 catches for less than 100 yards, and you spend the majority of that offseason hurt. You miss basically the entirety of fall camp, and you have to work and get as many reps as you can right close to the season. And then you have a pretty solid breakout year. I mean, it wasn't perfect. I mean, I think that Bell had a very good year. I wouldn't call it great, but I would call it good, especially when you play behind Jamari Thrash and the other guys that you have to feed in that offense, and considering the issues at quarterback. And I'm not here to talk about what went wrong last season. Chris Bell had a good season last year. Even more impressive when you factor in the time he spent hurt in the offseason leading up to that first game against Georgia Tech. Didn't necessarily have a great amount of time to build up the chemistry with Jack Plummer and get the reps in. That hasn't been the case this offseason. Tyler Shuck has raved about Chris Bell. Ever since Shuck got onto campus in the winter, he has started to build up that relationship and thrown to Chris Bell. Jeff Brohm has identified Bell as one of the offensive leaders throughout spring ball. He was arguably the MVP of the spring game, 3 catches for 126 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. He has put in the work. Brohm, again, has reiterated that the formula for getting better really isn't a rocket science equation. It's just a matter of being willing to put that work in and go the extra step, to go the extra mile, so to speak. And Chris Bell has done that. And for a guy that's 6'2", 220, that moves really, really well, that has a ton of potential, that screams that, put it this way, though, there are other mouths to feed in this offense. But I think that taking the next step for him definitely lands him on this list. Yes, you have Ja'Cory Brooks. Yes, you have Colin Lacey. One of, if not both, one or two of them will also be on this list. But with the season that Bell had last year, and he was the reliable pass catcher for good portions of the season, didn't have a game where he really, outside of NC State, where he had 3 for 85 and a touchdown, Pittsburgh, he had 4 for 48 and a touchdown. Outside of that, he really didn't have a game where he completely took over. That's the next step in his development, is being able to show that he can take over games, continually create that separation, and just be consistent from a game-to-game basis and don't disappear. You have a guy that had 400 receiving yards, that's had a really, really good spring where he was one of the best offensive players on the team. I just find it challenging to not place him on the top 15. Even if he's had like a pedestrian spring, I think he's good enough to land on this 15. The only thing that I kind of went back and forth on was just the level of production that he's going to see. Now, Brohm is going to open up the playbook more with improved quarterback play. You're going to see the play calling regress to the mean and not really reflect the outlier of last season, where the play distribution favored the run-heavy team. But you're going to throw the ball more and more this season. Now, you replace Jamari Thrash. You have to replace Amari Huggins-Bruce and Kevin Coleman Jr., but you bring in Colin Lacey from South Alabama, who's going to need targets. Ja'Cory Brooks from Alabama, who's also going to need targets. But with Brooks missing some of the spring due to injury, it's allowed Chris Bell to sort of step into that role and say, hey, look, I know you brought in 2 really good receivers, but don't forget about me. And I'll be honest, I am one of those people that theoretically in this argument he would be talking to, because when we got Lacey and Brooks, I was like, yeah, that's a great 1-2 punch. And then throughout the summer, things slowed down and sports stopped sporting like we want them to. And you have more time to really dive into an analytical approach. And I'm keep coming back to this notion of, man, I really feel like that I'm sleeping on Chris Bell a little bit. And you just can't do that, because he's a top 15 player for a reason. From a talent standpoint alone, he's phenomenal. 6'2", 220, going to continue to increase that strength and be just that much better as it comes to footwork, speed off of the line. And I'm intrigued here. This is one of the players that I'm like, okay, what's this role going to look like? Because you know what Lacey brings to the table. Ja'Cory Brooks is great too. But what about Chris Bell? Now, we've seen offenses that throw the ball a lot. 3 receivers can flourish, but also there's going to be an upgrade at the tight end spot. You're going to run the ball still. Tyler Shuck's going to run the ball some. So I've got Chris Bell at 14. I think he's going to make some big-time plays for this team. I am going to make the hot take that he's going to take over one game and be one of the main reasons that Louisville ends up victorious in a specific game. Which game that's going to be, I have zero clue. But I'm confident that he's going to leave his mark on at least one game, and he's going to be more consistent throughout the season itself. So Chris Bell landing at number 14 on this list for me. To conclude the first episode of the 5-part series, number 13, we go to the defensive side. A standout defensive back has been added to the Cardinals secondary. We'll identify who that is, landing at number 13, coming up in the final segment. And into the final segment of this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Once again, want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, Locked On Louisville free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. I do want to once again ask that you would like, subscribe, share this show on whatever social media platform you use. It would be definitely appreciated to help grow the listenership and the viewership of the show, and definitely appreciate all the everydayers that tune in constantly. It does not go unnoticed nor unappreciated. We're concluding the first part of the 5-part series, ranking the top 15 players from 15 down to 1. Obviously, if you're following this episode, you understand that it is 1 player per segment, so it will take all 5 episodes to get to number 1. And I hope you all enjoy the journey. Number 13 is a standout DB added to the secondary via the transfer portal. That is Central Florida cornerback Corey Thornton. Admittedly, if there's one player on my top 15 that might get left off the most if you ask 10 people to do their individual respective rankings, Corey Thornton is probably the one. Do not sleep on the multiple-year starter from Central Florida. What you're bringing to the Cardinals program is over 100 tackles from the defensive back spot, 4 interceptions, and I think around, 28 pass deflections, 139 total tackles. Now, he did play for Central Florida when the team was not in a Power 5 conference. They're in the American Athletic. But they make the transition to the Big 12 last season, and what happened? He had his best season in coverage. He had 3 interceptions as a senior, and he was consistently one of the highest graded defensive backs, not only defensive backs, one of the highest graded defenders on this Central Florida team. So you bring a veteran guy to this defense that loses Jarvis Brownlee, loses a handful of other rotational pieces. Yes, you bring back Quincy Riley, and spoiler alert, he's going to be on this list, very highly on the list, I might add. But I think when you look at a guy like Corey Thornton, it's easy to sort of overlook him because of the guys on defense you bring back, right? In his 4 seasons down in Orlando, he started 38 games. That is over 3 full seasons of starting games. Now, this past season, he had a career low in tackles. He spent a portion of this season hurt, but the 6'1" native from Miami, Florida, has played a good amount of college football and played some very good offenses in that stretch. Played Louisville at one point in his college career. Having a solid cornerback to replace Jarvis Brownlee is going to be key for this defense if you're looking for the secondary to get better. Now, yes, I think that the pass rush and defensive line as a whole upgraded, but you still have to have the guys in the back half of this secondary to be able to hold down the fort. Getting Quincy Riley back is monumental, to say the least. MJ Griffin returning from his season-ending injury last season is monumental, to say the least. But those 2 guys can't do it by themselves. And yes, you brought in guys like Taz Nicholson. You brought in a player like Tay Holloway. And I think that these guys are really going to prove to be extremely valuable And don't get me wrong, they're going to play a key role for this team. Like I said, you can take this a couple different ways. And some people would have Taz Nicholson on this list. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. The Jacksonville, Florida native was really solid for a very good defense. But I'm going to go with Corey Thornton, basically 4-year starter, just had his best season in coverage, serviceable at the very least in defending the run and tackling with good technique and bringing that leadership to a secondary that needs it right away. I think he'll start. If he doesn't start, he's going to be key in the rotation. This was probably the one that I went on a limb for the most and said, I'm going to bank on Corey Thornton being as good as I believe he's going to be. And I put him at 13, but truthfully, 15 to 13. A lot of these rankings, you will see the difference between one ranking and another ranking really isn't that much. Like 3 to 7 really isn't that much of a difference. So don't take 15 on the ranking being, oh, he's further down than 13. I mean, you're talking about splitting hairs, and at this point, it's just personal preference. So, but I do think, back to the topic at hand, getting a guy that has a ton of football under his belt, just had his best season of covering the field, has that repertoire being a good run defender, coming to a team that needs a starting cornerback too, which I believe that he ultimately will win that position battle. The production level is going to be there. He's really talented. So the talent, the production, the impact that he's going to have puts him at 13 on this respective list. And as I mentioned, not that large of a difference between 13 and 15. I will say this as we sort of wrap up the show. We're going to do our best to continue this series simultaneously. So back to 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 back. Yeah, that's 5. 5 episodes in a row of the player rankings. I'm going to do my best not to split those up. Now, I understand that having 5 straight episodes, that, you know, the first one airing on a Wednesday, you're going to have the weekend in between that. There might be an episode or even 2 of things that are totally unrelated. I'll try to keep you all updated as much as I can before that aspect, but obviously you'll know right away if an episode is a top 15 player rankings episode, but nonetheless, appreciate you all tuning in. We are a little under a month away from that opening kickoff against Austin Peay. This month is just going to drag. So we're going to get really analytical and exploratory into this Louisville team and to see how good they're going to be. And like I said, got a couple of series coming up, player rankings, schedule breakdown, and much more. But that's going to wrap up this Wednesday edition of the show. Once again, no Thursday episode, at least not Thursday morning, but probably not a Thursday episode anyways. But